today we're going to actually talk about glazing our wall pockets or slab device holders. Now, what we're going to talk about today actually goes for everything we're glazing from here moving forward. So it's really important information for you to kind of listen to and absorb. So, first, let's get started with where everything is. Hopefully you have your device holder or your slab pocket. This is my slab wall pocket that I'm going to be glazing today. The first thing you're going to need is sandpaper. This is optional, but if you have sharp edges, especially like along here that you want to sand down and make really nice and smooth, this is your last chance to do that. So sandpaper is right here next to the tools. You just get a little piece. Please stand over a garbage can. Here I have a garbage can. And I'm just going to gently sand away my parts that have some sharper edges. The reason that's really important is because once we put glaze on it, that glaze turns to glass and those sharp edges become actually really, really sharp and could potentially cut somebody. So it also just helps it look really nice and finished. So now that we have it sanded down, we have some dust on here we need to take care of. So here I have a bucket of water. You can use the faucet. You don't have to take a bucket of water to your table. An elephant ear sponge. I'm just gonna dip it in here, get it wet, bring it out, and then I'm gonna use this sponge to kind of just wipe away. It's like I'm dusting my clay project here, getting all the dust off. Now you'll notice it dries almost instantly. It's because our clay is so porous and so much moisture has been removed from it through the firing process that any moisture we add at this point, it's like it disappears right before your eyes. So cleaned off all my dust. You can see kind of I have some red dust on there. Next I need to pick out my glaze color. So our glazes are all back here in this corner, and some of them have photos on the glaze bottle of what the glaze looks like. But I have test tiles, and that's what I really want you to look at and to reference, because glaze does not look the same in the bottle as it does on the test tile. For example, back here I have dark blue, okay? It looks very blue. But if I find the bottle of dark blue over here, the glaze actually looks light lavender, purple, okay? So this is what the glaze looks like, but when it's fired, but when I'm painting it on before the firing, it's just like a powdery glaze that actually looks light purple. So do not go by the bottles, go by your test tiles. These are the test tiles we're gonna be using for this project. They are all low fire glazes. The bottles back here now are mixed. There are some underglazes, some high fire glazes, and some low fire glazes. You need to make sure you are always choosing a glaze with a pink dot. The pink dot is the low fire glaze. Now, up here, these are all low fire glazes. So as long as you choose a glaze from up here and it has a pink dot on the lid when you go to retrieve it, you're good to go. So, how do we figure out what glaze is what? So if you find a color you really like, okay? For this particular project, we're using red clay and we're using texture. We're really highlighting our texture. So I want you to choose a glaze that has a red test tile, first of all. Not all of them. Like this one is a red test tile. Some of them just only have white test tiles. We want to use a semi-transparent glaze because we really want to highlight the fact that we use this red clay. We want to show it off. So choose a test tile that has a red test tile sample with it. Those are the glazes that are going to work best for this project. Alright, so if I go through here and I decide that I want to do, I'm going to actually do this one right here, which is, if I look on the back, there's the title. It's white clover. When you get your glaze, you want to make sure that it's mixed really well. So we actually make sure the lid is on really well. People do not put the lids on correctly sometimes. So check the lid, make sure it's on really well. And then you're going to shake it. Now, this one that I opened actually was pretty dried out, so I added just a touch of water to it. In fact, you can hear the crumbs shaking around in there. It's getting a little bit better as I'm doing this. But I want to shake it until it is about the consistency of acrylic paint. That's a pretty good consistency for what I'm doing. All right, so while this is kind of soaking and getting sorted out, I'm going to get my brush. The brushes you use, we actually have special glazed brushes. The brushes are all down here in a bucket, labeled glazed brushes. And we've got a variety of sizes. You want to choose the size that is appropriate for what you're doing. So since I have some nooks and crannies, I'm going to choose, I kind of like this medium-sized brush right here. Okay. First thing I want to do is make sure there's no residual glaze left in it. So I'm going to just rinse it in my bucket here. Make sure it's clean. You can do this at the sink, obviously. And I'm actually going to shape the bristles into the shape I want them to be. Okay. Now, the other thing you might decide you need is a turntable, especially if you're glazing something that is round. The turntables are over here. I never want you to glaze on top of a canvas board. You should always glaze on top of your desk or a laminate board or a wheel. The reason I don't ever want you to glaze on top of a canvas board is because the glaze is hard to get off the canvas board, and we don't ever want to get glaze into our clay before we do a bisque firing. All right, so I have my brush ready. I have my turntable. This turntable is really nice because it allows us to turn this while we're glazing without actually touching the piece. Okay, I'm going to glaze every surface of this except the part that touches the shelf in the kiln. So in this case, my back, I'm not going to glaze. If you did a device holder, you would glaze everything, and you could even glaze the underside of it, except for the parts that are touching the table when you set it. This is your device holder. You can glaze the whole top. You can even glaze in here if you want to. Where you can't glaze is right here, here, and here. Anything that is touching the kiln shelf when you set it down like this. All right, so for glaze, we want to put at least 3 coats of glaze on there. And so I get my brush in here. I'm going to mix it around even more with my brush to make sure it's really nice and coated. Now, whether you do 3 or 4 coats is going to depend on how thick your glaze ends up being. This glaze is pretty thin, but not super thin. So I'm going to kind of see how much coverage 1 coat does, but I think 3 is going to be fine because it's not too watered down. Now my goal is to make sure that it is really even, and I'm not going to start my second layer until this first layer is mostly dry. That's important because some people want to rush through the glazing process and then they think they're putting on the right number of layers, but because they didn't wait for it to dry, they are not. Now, what happens if your glaze isn't put on evenly? Well, first of all, you won't be able to tell just by looking at it before it gets fired. The real imperfections don't show up until it actually fires in the kiln and comes out. And then you'll be really disappointed that you didn't get it unevenly because they're very, very noticeable. You want to make sure that you get it even because what happens is that the glaze will look beautiful in the parts where you have it on thick enough and very evenly, but the parts where it's thin, after it comes out of the kiln, it looks very spotty and very bad. So you want to make sure that you are being consistent when you're putting it on, and you're not just guessing, like you're actually paying attention to how much glaze you're putting on and that you're putting on the right number of coats. So I'm almost done here with my first coat. It really doesn't take very long. Now what might happen as well is that you might have some details in your piece that disappear, some carved details or textures that disappear once you paint your glaze on, and that is totally okay. Those textures will really pop out when your piece gets fired. As long as you're using a transparent or semi-transparent glaze, which is what I told you at the beginning to look for, your details will really start to show once it gets fired, even though they disappear at this point in the game. Now you'll notice my glaze is going on. It has some chunks in it. It's totally fine. I'm not worried about those. Those will melt down. It's very opaque. It will not be opaque when it comes out of the kiln and once it gets fired the second time for glaze firing. And like I mentioned earlier, your glaze might not match what you actually want it to be. There's a really good chance it won't, in fact. You know, if it looks purple, but it's supposed to be blue, it will be blue. Just make sure that you get the right number of coats on it. Now you'll notice my first coat in some places is already starting to dry. Like I could start a second coat now. And I think I will do that. Now, what happens if you get some glaze on the bottom of your piece or on the back? So here, I have a little bit right here where it kind of bled over. Don't worry about that until you're done. When you are done, you can wipe it away with a damp elephant ear sponge, or you can sand it away if it's dry with sandpaper. But you do want to make sure you remove that before you put it over here to be fired. So, remember, no glaze on the bottom. You want to make sure your coats, your layers are very, very even, and you want to do usually 3 coats. Okay? If you have any questions along the way, just let me know, and I'm excited to see how these turn out for you.